Hello YouTube, Manibil here. I wanted to make a sort of final video on my sort of thoughts about UPB, and I've rested a while on going through the deconstruction. And maybe a sort of a slight weakness could be said that I stop sort of halfway through the book, because the rest of the book is merely examples of moral statements being sort of grinded through UPB, the UPB framework. And there are four examples of that, rape, theft, assault, and murder. And why there are four of them, I don't know why that is necessary. It's like four is better than one, I suppose. So it's always sort of an indication that it's not only necessary to prove it, you have to prove it 4 times, so it's 4 times better. But that to me only makes it sort of weaker, that you need to do the same thing 4 times to prove your point. Is like saying, well, 1 time isn't enough because people are not going to believe it or something like that, right? And but there's a lot of things in that. Maybe I'll get back to it. But I have my notes that I took sort of jotted down throughout the discussion or throughout the deconstruction, and I added a few here to start with. And sort of the overall idea is, okay, what are we really dealing with here, right? What are we really dealing with? And my point is, what I would love to be the case was that everything in here condensed into a moral principle. I mean, that's what I'm looking for, right? If I'm going to, I want a car, right? I'm not going to be satisfied with the auto manual or the car manual or how to drive the car. So I want to drive the fucking car, right? I want to have the car, right? I don't want a picture of the car. I don't want to have an explanation of what a car is or how to figure out what car to buy or any sort of guide like that. I want the real thing. And I don't know why. I've never seen this approach before. Maybe it's just my ignorance, which is certainly possible. But it's like, as I pointed out during the deconstruction, is like he does sort of the 95% of it, and then he says like, okay, it's up to you the rest, right? You do the rest. Sort of chickening out at 100 meters before the end goal of the Tour de France, right? He's in Paris and going, there's 100 meters and they say, okay, I'm going off the bicycle, you do the rest, right? I said, come on, man, why don't you do the rest? And it's sort of, if it's made there to validate moral principles, why do you need to do all these jump through hoops afterwards? Like, at least half of the book is applying your framework to principles that then can be used to. So there's not only is it sort of, it feels decapitated, or it feels that something is missing. It's sort of, it's only 90% towards the goal, and you sit there like, okay, so what can I do now? What if I'm standing in somewhere and it's not rape and it's not assault and it's not a theft, and another thing is that these things, or these examples, rape, theft, assault, and murder, are not moral principles, but they're sort of moral statements. So what about moral principles like the non-aggression principle, which is not a specific thing, but a principle about how to act in general? So why are these specific cases taken out? I'm not saying they're insignificant or anything like that. I'm just pointing out the approach or the understanding of what we're doing here, right? Or how the reader might interpret or misinterpret what you're doing. So if it's for checking moral principles, why do you need to bring in certain cases to understand how to approach UPB? Because it seems it's sitting on two chairs and falling in the middle, right? Give some examples of moral principles that can be run through UPB, not moral statements like murder is wrong, right? And another thing with these murder, rape, assault, and theft is that they are already morally loaded terms. And I point that out several times during the deconstruction, so you can go and look it up during the whole deconstruction. But it's like, if you bring in morality through the back door, it's no wonder that you can talk about morality, right? And say you have created something, but you are cheating. You're cheating. You should call it what it is from an objective standpoint. If you are objective about it, you should stay with objectivity. But a moral judgment is a purely subjective stance. It's your judgment of whether or not something is rape or not, right? So you are conflating all these into sort of a gumbo of all sorts of philosophical terms that are equivocated and equated and sort of, and it's very wordy. Yeah, I'm not sure the correct word for that, but sort of a word salad. There's a lot of repeating the same things, or it sounds like you're talking about the same thing that you did 3 pages back, or 10 pages back, or 30 pages back, and sort of bringing in, now we're talking about science, and now we're sort of this subjectivity over here, and there's objectivity, and the truth is this, and truth is that, and definitions that are, you know, hard to understand or even impossible to understand. So at the end, it's like I am confused on a higher plane, right? I'm more qualified confusion about ethics than when I started with reading the book. It's sort of, it branches out like sort of a huge network, and then sort of stops in the middle of everything, and you just sort of left there. What am I going to do with this? So the short thing is that it doesn't work. I mean, it can't work. Nobody can use this for anything. Even if there is something good in it or useful in it, it can't work because it's so confusing to just trying to understand what you're trying to say, right? So, I mean, from a sort of a foundational stance, it has to be rejected until it has been clarified what the hell you're talking about. Another point is that principles seem to be able to be conjured at will. Like there's no statement about, okay, how do you create a moral principle? Is there any rules for creating moral principles? Can anything? So this is a pen. Is that a moral principle? That statement, is that this pen is nice? This is my pen. You know, what does it take for something to be a moral principle? Or are we? Can anything be, you know, shoved through UPB? Because then it seems too loose as a framework. Because I don't even know what you mean by, you know, a moral statement, right? So does it have to be a preconceived moral statement like rape? But what makes something rape or makes something murder or whatever, right? So you're sort of bringing in morality through that back door, as I mentioned, and then I don't know how to experience that which you call objective, because you're so focused on objective, and you know that another term that is not explained is this subjectivism or something like that, right? So if it's subjective, point out how I understand it's theft, right? And if you say, but that is because somebody don't want their things to be taken. But how do I experience their want? Well, that's a part of their mind, but I can't experience their mind. So you're trying to also violate the problem of other minds, and you do not deal with sort of metaphysics and epistemology because you don't think it's necessary. There's so much work to do here. So there's so many loose ends and things that should be in place for people to understand what you're talking about that isn't there. So it has to be rejected. It has to be rejected. Any decent, rigid, serious philosopher should reject this as useless, in my opinion, right? Another thing that I might sort of, when I said you're chickening out, 100 meters before the finishing line, right, is that might be because you don't want to go the whole 9 yards, like saying, okay, this is the moral principle, and it's sort of cut out in stone, and this is you can put it on your wall or something like that. Stefan Molyneux says, right? You don't want to go that far because that's where the rubber meets the road, right? This is where this is the nuclear statement, right? If there's something wrong in it, it could potentially mean the death of thousands of millions of people, right? So that's where the balls should be. Do you have the balls to go all the way? And the obvious answer is no, you don't. You don't have the cojones to go all the way, right? And so you don't have that final moral principle, which means you can bring in any moral principles you already have before you started working on this sort of framework. And lo and behold, non-aggression principle fits the bill. I mean, it's like, okay, come on, man. I mean, are you just trying to fit it around what you're connecting the dots in the confirmation bias? You're connecting the dots in the direction that you need to go. If you already have the principle, you should sort of start with a blank slate and then work from metaphysics, epistemology, and what is knowledge and what is truth and what is objectivity and so on, what is ethics and moral principle, and here it is, right? The complete list, right? Ending up just proving that the principle you're already working from is valid. It's like, come on, that doesn't work, right? As you yourself state somewhere, if it doesn't sort of push back on something that we already consider moral, then it's not really that serious, right? And it doesn't push back on anything you consider sort of moral or immoral beforehand. So it might be pushing back on somebody else, but it's certainly not pushing back on what you understand beforehand. So it leads the reader to conclude that you're sort of connecting the dots in a way that ends up with the result you want, because then everything sort of fits together, right? Okay, so one of the things in the subtitle is being secular. There's no mention at all anywhere, as far as I could find, and there may be in the last half, which I haven't reviewed or deconstructed, that goes into that secular. But I can't take that serious because the first part is that which proves the framework. So if UPB is a framework, then the whole first part is the proof. And it says nothing about secular. If there is a small note somewhere, it's so small that it's insignificant compared to what does it mean that it's secular? How do I know it's secular? Well, you don't handle that part at all, right? And why is it, what does it mean that it's rational? It's a rationality in compared to this UPB framework. What's rational about it? Because the way I see rationality compared to reasoning, rationality is a certain kind of reasoning. And I define rationality as reasoning about that which is valuable for you, right? So if we say that, okay, but maybe you pull these two terms together in reasoning and rationality. So what is rational or reasonable about the framework. What is that content that you refer to in the subtitle that makes it rational or reasonable, right? Is it that it's not secular? Because then just repeating the same. I mean, I don't. It's just sort of. I have to put the pieces together myself afterward. It would be nice if it was sort of handed to me in the book. That's why I expect to get something out of reading the book and not having to piece things together afterwards myself. Okay, so there were a lot of, I noted that it was still version 1 after 14 years, so there's not a single comma that has been changed officially. There has been a couple of videos and, directly addressing, not in sort of any big way, it sort of just tries to clarify a few things here and there. That's not really that deep. But there's no official version 2 or version 3 or whatever of UPB, which would be natural unless you think you're perfect, right? Unless you think that I have to write this book and this one is it's just freaking perfect, right? So there's a sort of a lot of terms that I hooked onto from the start to see how well were they sort of explained during the book. And the author talks a bit about universality, but I don't think that I was really enlightened too much about what he really understood as universality. But if he understands it as what I got was that universality in his term it's independent of who we are talking about. It's independent of where we are talking about, and it's independent of when we are talking about. And if that is what his understanding of universality is, then I would agree about universality. So preferability is another one that I'm quite skeptical about, because it seems to me that he very early on makes a jump from liking something to preferring something. That liking something is sort of a direct experience, object to individual, but preferring something is purely a thought process that I prefer this object rather than this object. So there's no particular object in that comparison, right? So that it might be sort of not the biggest jump in the world, but I feel that it was certainly not explained sufficiently to make that leap. It's sort of a small version of Hume's is-ought gap, right? There's a leap there between categories or something like that, and it's not explained sufficiently, in my opinion. Behavior was implicitly, as far as I remember it, implicitly explained as not being actions, but sort of categories of actions, like eating. But there's no particular object involved in eating as such. It doesn't say whether or not it's a burger or it's an orange or it's a bread or whatever, right? It's still eating, because it's sort of behavior is categories of actions with the same purpose. But then behavior becomes a mental construct, not what is going on in reality. And when he starts to refer to specific actions, which he does a few times, I think at least once, he is violating his own rules in staying at behavior. It's a part of the title. I mean, so if he starts to talk about specific actions, well, then you can't use that as an argument, because we're talking behaviors. And he switches a few times between these two and violates his own sort of ground rules in that sense, right? I talked about rationality. Proof is not something I think should be mentioned in ethics, because proof is not about ethics, or it's not philosophy. Proof is sort of a scientific method, right? And that's another thing we'll get back to. a proof. You can't prove truth. You can't prove. Proof is not a part of philosophy. You can philosophize about what a proof is, but you can't use proof to establish philosophy. So secularism, as I mentioned before, isn't explained at all. Truth is very, very difficult to understand and I'll get back to it, I think, later down here. There are several understandings of what truth is and a very convoluted definition of truth that is practically useless in my opinion, right? Fact is mentioned, and it's not that clear what a fact is, but I don't think that it is not very different from how I understand a fact. If I say that's an elephant and it's a true proposition to me, then the fact is elephant, right? So that's sort of the simple way, and it's not defined as such in the book, but I think it's fairly decently, correctly used in a philosophical sense. Objectivity. This is so objectivity and subjectivity is skewed. I'm not sure what word to use, but it seems like truth, objectivity, and science and these things are sort of lumped together in something that is reality, and then there is your subjective understanding of reality. And this faulty metaphysics results in all sorts of weird stuff, weird understandings like subjectivity is not philosophy and so on, right? And all sorts of other things that result from this sort of materialist or physicalist understanding of metaphysics, or dualist even, is the hard problem of consciousness, which is not referred to or mentioned at all as a problem, right? So how do you get to objectivity if there's no way what it feels like to experience the world and your description of that reality, like matter and energy, which is mentioned in the book. So there's nothing in matter and energy that must become the experience of red, and not at the end of the day, it's the experience of red that you have, right? Everything is an interpretation of some other aspects that you correlate with the experience red. So these things are there's a huge problem in metaphysics, and therefore also in epistemology, which sort of derails his ethics completely, or more or less completely, right? And consistency and empiricism and methodologies and validation, and these terms are not settled, like they are used, and you have to, from the context they're used in, you have to find sort of, okay, so I think this is what he means when he uses that term, right? And I mean, it's not every term under the hood that needs to be defined, so like, an encyclopedia or something like that. But there are some central core terms and ideas that needs that you can go back to and say, yeah, that's what he means, right? So that, I mean, that's a part of philosophy, defining your terms, so that the reader knows whether or not you are adhering to your own understanding. You're not sort of drifting out on a tangent somewhere, and then all of a sudden you're proving something, right? Then the reader can go back and say, no, you're violating your own definitions here, right? So that's what they're needed for. So we have so the reader knows what you mean by that term, right? Even though if there's a consensus on Wikipedia or somewhere on Stanford or whatever about what a term means, that doesn't mean that you understand it, right? You could have a weird understanding. I mean, there's no specific way a word should be understood. but it makes sense to use words in a way that people already use them in, as far as it is possible within the confinements of creating good philosophy, right? Sometimes you need to create a new word, or use a word in a different way, or settle the definitions so that they're sharp with regard to what you're doing. So that is a big weakness in this book. There are no definitions really apart from truth, right? Okay, then he talks about truth instincts and truth intuitions. This is weird, right? Because isn't that subjective? I mean, and his rejection of subjectivity as philosophy, it's like, but then now you're talking about subjective understanding of truth. I mean, what are you doing, right? And these moral premises, murder, rape, assault, and theft, are brought in as sort of already created moral premises, but he does not point out what is moral about them or immoral, and then thereby he violates his first ground rule, which is Hume's is or gap, right? So, okay, let's see. And there's one here that I particularly make me distrust what he's doing, right? Then it tries to be sort of not too loaded on the words and too direct or too whatever, right? But then some of emotional spurts like this one comes. I have not spent years of my life working on a theory of ethics in order to run around proving that murder is wrong, right? Statements like this is ridiculous in a philosophical dissertation of any kind, right? I have not spent years of my life working. It's like a little child. Yeah, I don't want to do this. It's ridiculous. I mean, it's like I have to, pinch myself. Did you write that? Is this a part of your moral theory that I did not spend years of murder is wrong? No. Fine, but could you at least point out what makes that thing you're referring to immoral, right? You said it's a moral statement. What is moral or immoral about it? How do you experience that in this objectivity only world, right? Please, but you can't, right? You can't, because you have to jump Hume's is or gap, which you promised not to do. Okay, so there was something he called the problem of subjectivism. He mentions it 2 or 3 times, or maybe more, and never explains what it is. Then Hume's law is mentioned in the first ground rule, and there are, as far as I understand or remember, no further mention of Hume's law. And then he tries to violate it by bringing in these moral terms: rape, theft, assault, and murder. And he doesn't seem to understand that there's a problem there, right? What is the scientific method doing in ethics? How does he combine scientific method and ethics? Because these things are usually kept separate, right? Sam Harris tried to write a book, or he wrote a book called The Moral Landscape, which is an insult to philosophy and ethics, trying to say that science can tell people what is good and bad. Well, it can't, right? It's ridiculous, right? You can't take some instrument and put on the world and say, aha, moral, or aha, immoral, right? It's the human understanding of how the world works. So you have to have the human understanding of things in order to decipher whether or not something is moral or not. This combination of the scientific, or this almost like equating scientific method equates UPB, or UPB equates scientific method, is ridiculous, right? Why don't you just say, okay, my framework, just go and look for the scientific method and then you'll know everything. Why do you need to write a 130-page book if UPB equates the scientific method? Are you saying there's something wrong with the scientific method since you have to write a book on 130 pages? Or are you trying to jump a gap that isn't there? Or are you just trying to, you're blue stamping your ethics with this, objective scientific method. You can't argue against the scientific method, and I'm going to lean up against it. So it's like, fuck you, right? Yeah, and I'll jump through this. He talks about perception, a concept, and senses, and use a term like an airtight compliance. These terms, that is an airtight compliance, right? Well, it's a small thing, I know, but it's annoying that you use an argument like this is an airtight compliance. What the frick is that, right? So it's sort of it becomes more like Monty Python sketch than rigid philosophy, right? At least I would approach very gently using terms like this, right? I would avoid at all costs personally. So, but what is perception and concepts and senses? How does these things hang together? And he doesn't explain that. Okay. And then there are used terms like learning the truth requires that we see the world from outside without sense. So there's what is the truth, right? Maybe it's a figure of speech or something, but then it's a very, very poorly chosen figure of speech when you are using a term that you haven't defined yet, and when you define it, you have all sorts of weird definitions like little truth, middle truth, and great truth that are 3 different categories, and and later there's a greater, a more comprehensive definition of truth. This is down here, I think. Yes, which is existence of truth. He is referring to truth as something that exists. Truth does not exist. It's a conclusion of sorts, right? And measuring truth and according to criteria. The terms he uses are so incorrect in connection with the idea of truth that I have to reject it, because it's like he doesn't know what he's talking about, right? Okay, so, and when we get to the definition of truth, right? Truth is a measure of a correlation between 2 kinds of ideas, right? And these ideas are consistence of rationality and the behavior of matter and energy. So this is like, what the hell is this, right? What? I mean, and they're not defined. These terms are not defined. So if I had some idea what he's talking about, I would be uncertain about it because I don't have definitions of these terms. So it's completely useless, this definition of truth. And I might add that in another video here, I go through several of his definitions of truth through the years, and there seems to be no real red thread through his definitions. It's like he's just, defines it as he sort of sees fit that particular day when he wrote it, right? There seems to be no coherence through the definitions during the last 15 years, right? Okay. And yes, so I think that was sort of a little rounding of my experience deconstructing UPB, and the idea with deconstructing it is that then you have you have a possibility, you have a chance to get down and talk about the real quotes, the real writing in the book, right? Where if you are reading the book and making a review, you wouldn't be able to point out all these bad things that are in the book, because they would be sort of references to larger terms like truth and knowledge and ethics, and then it would drown in these big terms. But going through it this way, constantly, one situation or one quote after the other points out how badly formulated this is, right? And how useless it is, and it doesn't get to the goal, and it confuses Hume's Is-Ought gap, and it can't define things. And I mean, the list goes on and on and on and on about how bad this moral philosophy is. right? And it's weird that nobody seems to be pointing it out. Why? All these people sitting on his, all his fans and all his supporters, haven't they read the book? Or are they just so ignorant that they say, well, the agenda behind the morality is that it's secular and it's rational, and I need that because I don't want to, I don't want God, and I don't want, prime ministers, right? So there's no all other alternative than hang on to this piece of junk because it says it's secular and it's rational, right? And I'm afraid, I fear that this is sort of, people haven't really, if they have read the book, they're sort of confused on a higher plane, right? And otherwise they've just heard a few videos here and there, and if you argue against it, you can't. And maybe that's one of those I haven't delved into too much. But the central argument really is, if you argue against me, you prove that I'm right. That sort of condenses his way of arguing for this principle or this framework, is that if you argue against me, I'm right. And that's so ridiculous. Even if people can't argue against it, I would lean against his claim that Aristotle said that if you prove that your morality says that rape is not immoral, then there's something wrong with your UPB, right? With your ethics. If you say you have created an argument that if I try to argue against it, you have proven my argument or my ethics, then there's something wrong with it, right? There must be something wrong somewhere. I have pointed out a few things during the deconstruction where I think this argument fails, and it primarily has to do with the term behavior. So, okay, I hope you enjoyed it. Let me just say that I'm happy that it's over now. I spent like 11, 12 hours deconstructing UPB. I think I've done the best I could with what I've got, and I hope it clarifies things for you and at least appeals to your skepticism about how to understand this. So have a nice day. See you next time.